web clients. And so what nowadays HTML is a good way to think about it is kind of like the language that you use to speak to a web browser, to this particular like little built-in operating system. And so like we'll start off with the very basics of HTML, and then we'll get into styling, and then we'll do a little bit about SVG, and then next Tuesday we'll start on how we can actually build interactive programs with the real programming language, specifically JavaScript. Okay, so the very first thing that you need to know about HTML is that it consists of elements. So here, for example, this is the code strong, this is an HTML element. So the whole thing here is called an element. The element has a type, the type is strong, and then this is the text that is contained within an element. And here, this is how this is displayed. So this is basically strong, it's just another way of saying bold. So we have some kind of like semantic meaning that this is something I want to emphasize in the text. So that's quite simple. But we can also, of course, nest this. So here is something where I have a strong element, and then I have a nested U element. The U stands for underline. So this is all of this is strong, and then here this piece here is also underlined. And by the way, if you have any questions, just interrupt me anytime. The next thing about HTML elements is that we can add attributes about it. So we can say, like a common thing to do is, for example, to specify, like we have the anchor element here, which is what we use for links. Historically, anchor like meant also like an anchor on a page. We don't really use this anymore to define anchors. We use it now to define links. And so here we have the href attribute, which points to a website. And so notice href equals, and then in single commas, you can also use double commas. And then you have the content of the text that is displayed. And so here you see a link to the School of Computing website. And the link here is defined, like you can see it down there. The link here is defined by this attribute. And so there's some specific styling that is by default applied to a link element, like an underline and then it's blue, but we can of course modify that, and we'll learn later how to do that. So as I said, single or double quotes, both are okay. We can then use something that's called a title attribute. That's kind of like an important, tooltips are an important feature in data visualizations, because very often we want to like visualize a data point, and then on hover, you can show more information about that data point. And so that's the cheapest way to actually do that. So you could say, like, for example, what is the exact values of a data point with this title attribute. There's, of course, other ways of doing that, and you have to be like a little bit careful in SVG. I'll talk about this later. We will use element attributes in pretty much every example now. We will use the ones ID, class, and style very frequently. I'll talk about class and style when I talk about CSS. ID is like a special attribute that essentially allows us to uniquely identify an element on a site. So think of it in a programming language context as if you tag an element with an ID attribute, it's like a global variable, which has pros and cons, of course. So ID attributes are very useful, but if you have too many of them and you have to rely too much on them, you're probably doing something wrong with your programming approach. So we'll talk about ways to handle this properly later. The ID attribute also is cool because it kind of like it serves as an anchor directly into like any part of the page. So if I define something with an ID, then I can also jump directly to that. Well, I think I have an example somewhere later. I'm probably getting ahead of myself here. Okay, so one thing that you noticed is that I've always done this, like element begins, then some content of the element, then element closes. We have a couple of elements that are called self-closing elements. So for example here, if we have something like break a line, break a line is like a canonical example, then we can also, instead of saying break, and then break close, we can also say, we can use this syntax here. So just like foo and then self-closing tag. However, the latest standards, we can also do like just completely omit the the self-closing tag. So anybody, like, okay, some background why this, like, this is kind of the way it used to be until before HTML5, right? So you had these self-closing tags because back then HTML was still completely compatible with XML. XML is like a markup language, a more generic markup language. But HTML5 has deviated from XML, and so now you can have elements that don't actually have any self-closing aspect of it. So nowadays you can actually do things like this break, and it's perfectly legal. There's some other things that you can do like that. Okay, so this here is a summary of different tags. I'll just like show you, like, I include images here, I have different headers, I have tables, I have ways to structure it, and then there's forms. And so let's go through some of those. So we start out with some meta information which isn't readily apparent in the output here, but I will talk about this a little bit later. The paragraph element essentially denotes a paragraph. So if you write text, you should always like put it within the paragraph. We can break a line, as I just mentioned, with a self-closing break tag or with a non-closing break tag. Either is fine. I can include images with the image tag, and then I simply have to specify the source as an attribute. And then I should always, like, if you include an image, you should always provide an alt. And alt is kind of like, if I were to look at this here, if I hover over this, it will actually, or it should show me the alternative description. It doesn't do it here. But anyways, the alt tag is useful mostly or especially for people with like that use a screen reader or for some like for computational processing an image. So this is supposed to be like a description of what is in your image. And to write valid HTML code, you always have to include an alt tag to your image, otherwise it's not going to validate. We can define headers on a text element with H1 to H6 tags. Obviously, H1 is highest level, and then we can go lower than that. We can define lists, both ordered lists here, so this is how we start a list. And then here we define list elements. And then like the list elements are LE, then the content, and then you have a closing LE tag. In HTML5, you do not have to have a closing LE tag anymore. So that is also something that wouldn't be compatible with XML, but now we can do this, and this is kind of like a nice short way to write HTML. We can have unordered lists like this, so just the same thing, and then we can use tables. And tables are, like I'm showing here a border, which is a styling, which you shouldn't actually try to, you should try to avoid mixing styling with presentation, but it's easier to see what's going on by using the border here. So we start a table, and then we have a row. The row is the table row. Then we have another row here. And then within the table row, we have nested cells. And we have two different types of cells, table headers and table data. So this is TH and TD. Nowadays, you should use tables really mostly for like when you have something tabular to display. Back in the day, people used tables to create styles for websites. So you would have like a table cell that is your menu bar, a table cell that is your main content, and so on. But this is real devices and on desktop or laptop computers. What you should use instead are kind of like these semantic structuring tags, like, well, there's more semantic ones, but the basic one is the div. Divs are division tags of a page, and you use them to kind of like say, this is my div that contains my like visualization. This is my div that contains the labels for, or the legend for the visualization, and so on. They do break the line here. So like, let's see what div example is. So here I have kind of like this line break here is because I have a closing div at the end here, and that's something that like is often useful, but sometimes you want to have some kind of like markup or some container that doesn't break the line. And so if you want to do that, you can use the span element. So the span element is similar to a div, but it doesn't break a line, so it's supposed to be inline. So the span is used for whenever you need to kind of like computationally identify something later that you want to specify in HTML. Okay, this might sound all a bit abstract, but you will see why this is useful when we start like accessing the stuff with JavaScript. And then we have forms. Forms are really like everything from buttons to text boxes to text areas and so on. And you have basically two or three different elements that are part of the form. There is a label, which kind of like is used to identify like the text for a particular input field. And then you have the input element. And for the input element, you have many different types. So you have the input type text, which is like a short field to enter some text. And then you have an input type submit, which is a submit button. And so notice that I have kind of like here, my input type text has an ID, the demo text field. And then the label has a for attribute, demo text field. So this basically means this label is the label for this input field here. And then the content of the label is within the tags, and the input itself here is self-closing, so basically I don't have to like have any content in that input. Like a special one is the special form element is the text area, which is like you can use the user input for multiple lines. So that doesn't use the type. Many other elements use the type here. And then finally, we also have a comment tag. The comment tag is, of course, useful to write comments, but also to temporarily remove any code from execution. Okay, that's the very quick introduction into HTML elements. Any questions?
Will you show us what the span is?
Yes. Yeah. So here we see, like here, if I, well, okay, I'll do something that I'll talk about later. But essentially here you can see the code that created this. So we see span is similar to div, but works as an inlet element. So see, there's no line break here. And so IE can be used in the same line. This is like two spans, but there's no line break here. So you can like see this is like goes continuous, but I still can identify each of these spans individually. So what I just did, I'll talk about this in a second, how I can inspect the code of a website. Does it answer your question? Good. Do we have also some kind of like necessary boilerplate for HTML documents? These are instructions for the browser how to display your websites. And so here, like this is like saying basically it's an HTML. We use we start the HTML code. The language is English. Then we have header information. We give a meta tag. Meta tags are like really explicit information for the browser. Like here we tell them you should use UTF-8 Unicode as your character set. And then we have the title. And this is page title. And so what we can do with this is also we can, like by the way, in this tool you can always say, or on the website you can say open in a new tab, and you have each example here completely atomic. And you can see that the title is kind of what renders in my browser tab up here. So this is the page title that I defined here. Okay, this is kind of in the meta tag, not shown directly in the HTML output, but instead used by the browser to identify your tab or the title of the page. And then we have the body where the visible content is. So there's other ones like style, where we can embed style, like CSS stylings into our websites. The link element, where we can include other sources to kind of create a more complicated website. And the script element, where we can embed JavaScript, and we'll be using this a lot. Okay, so obviously, if you've never seen HTML, 20 minutes of introduction into HTML is pretty rapid. But the one thing I want to say is the like the different, or like how is HTML related to the DOM? And so DOM is this document object model, and the DOM is basically, think of the DOM in the simple cases that I've shown here. It's pretty much just exactly the same thing as HTML, right? So the DOM is what the browser uses to render what it's showing. At the same time, the DOM is also a programming interface, so it contains a lot of functions that we'll be later using to manipulate what we see on a website. And especially when we use like JavaScript to generate like DOM elements, we will see that the DOM actually significantly deviates from what we show in HTML. So we'll have like some basic HTML, and then we'll create a lot of stuff automatically or using like JavaScript as a programming language. And all of that what we create at any given point in time is the document object model. And so you can always look at the document object model of a website through these like developer tools that every browser has built in. Like we'll be using Chrome as our reference browser in this class, so if your homework works in Chrome in the latest version, we're happy. We don't want you to have to worry about cross-browser compatibility. And so like just like use Chrome or check with Chrome at least if it works. I suspect that we won't have a lot of problems because browser compatibility has become a lot better in the last couple of years. Okay, so how can we look at the DOM? So first we can do view developer and then developer tools. And the developer tools essentially here in this element view, they reveal the whole DOM, the elements. And so here the DOM, of course, corresponds exactly to what I have put into this website, into this super simple website. The DOM has some other, or the developer tools have some other features. For example, I can like modify the styling here, and then I can use the console, and I can do like analyze how resources are loaded. I can do performance profiling, memory profiling, and so on. But the most important thing that we'll need is like looking at what is the output that we generate. What is basically the generated HTML, the DOM. And so this is kind of like simple here. But if you look at this website, it's a little bit more complicated, right? So here we could say, and like this is the other way to get to the developer tools, you can simply right-click on any object on a website and say inspect. And then you see here, like this is much more complicated DOM already, and it has some JavaScript built in and so on. And so we see like what is this element? So you can always ask like inspect, and then it will jump directly to the specific element. So we see that this necessary boilerplate title here was generated by an H3 with the ID necessary boilerplate, and that's it basically about that element. We can look at its styling here, and we can see exactly what its what its padding is and so on. And so once you hover over an element, it will actually also highlight on the website where you are currently hovering in the DOM. And that's a very, very useful tool for you guys to debug when you build visualizations. And that, of course, works equally with SVG. Okay. What I mentioned earlier, like the ID here, well, let's take this with me. I can use those as anchors. So I can put in, let's close this. I can put in a hashtag and then necessary boilerplate, and that will kind of jump directly to that particular place in the website. So that's kind of like, you don't specify an anchor anymore, you specify the ID of an element, and then you can add the ID of the element to your URL, and that will jump directly to that part of the website. Okay, any questions about basic HTML and the DOM? Okay, so let's move on to CSS. So here, I don't want to talk too much about styling, but CSS is cascading style sheet, so we can actually modify the appearance of how something looks on a website. And more importantly nowadays, we can also like basically create layouts and styles like dependent on the device that the person is using. So you can create responsive designs. But we'll mostly kind of ignore most of that. That would be stuff that we would cover in a web development course. What we'll be doing here is really to like go through the basics of CSS and then talk mostly about selectors, because we will need those selectors to then programmatically manipulate our DOM. So this is kind of like, we'll talk a little bit about styling, but really the main purpose of this part of the lecture is to be able to identify elements in our DOM. Okay, so one thing that you should, I also wanted to note, there is, like, if you Google for something on, let's say, if I Google for CSS, it will probably bring up this website, w3schools.com. Don't go there. Like when you Google for some HTML element, like W3 schools, it's not completely terrible, but it's very often wrong and outdated. And so what you always should do instead is add MDN. MDN is Mozilla Developer Network, and that's kind of like the unofficial documentation for everything on the web. So you will see that I linked a ton to MDN. And so this is developer.mozilla.org, and then you have the information. And they are very careful about what they're saying. They have pretty cool examples, and they also tell you about browser compatibility. So basically, like whenever you do something, like you search for something related to web programming, you should always put in MDN so that you end up on their website. Okay, so for like here's a detailed like tutorial and links for like CSS and MDN, and you can do this of course also for HTML. It's basics. But so like what is CSS? Cascading style sheets, and that basically already hints at that it's about styling. And so how we can specify CSS, we can specify it either in a style element in the header or in an external file. But we'll for now work with style elements in the HTML header. So here is an example. Here we have like a simple website, and what we have as an output is some text, and a part of it is strong and has an increased font size and has a red background, right? And if you look at the HTML for that, it doesn't have any of the markup information on how this should be displayed and what color it should be in the HTML. Where we really define all of this is in the style up here. And so what we do here is in the style tag we say for all strong elements, give them a background color, like this is a hex code for a color, and then change the font size to 150%. Right? And so this is then, like, this is the way you would select an element. So this is applied to all strong elements. So for example, if I added more text, and then part of it strong, then this will be also applied to this piece here. So the test one here is like also matches that rule, and so that's why we have all of the strong elements are here being styled according to this rule here. So this is called an element selector. And then you can define multiple rules what to do within curly brackets, and you have to, like all but the last one, you have to terminate with a semicolon here. And there's many different of these attributes. Again, I'm not going to go into the details. You will pick them up as we need them. Okay, so what we can also do, like we can define either each of those rules within one group here, or we can define them in multiple groups. And so basically what happens behind the scenes is like this goes through linearly, and then it always applies, like it first applies this, and then it applies this. And so these two are completely equivalent. You will see that they have the same output, so like this looks exactly the same. Of course, I could have like, this could be like a class selector, the other one could be an element selector, right? So I can apply multiple different rules to a single element by matching different selectors. Okay. So, like I mentioned the word before, but now I kind of like want to formally introduce this, class selectors. Class selectors, like we have the element selector here that select everything of a specific element type. That's not very granular, right? I might like sometimes want to use strong in some layout, and in other cases want to use a different layout. Or especially when I want to use like divs, I might want to like be very detailed about which div I style it which way. And so one way to do this is to use these class selectors. We can create these classes of styles. And a class selector is defined by a leading, or identified by a leading period. For example, we could have like a class that's called dot menu. Here we have classes that I call dot important and dot footnote, right? So two very different things. I give the dot important, I give it a style bold, and dot footnote, I reduce the font size, not moving anything around. And so then I create three divs here, and I give them a class attribute. I call this first one here class important, the second one class footnote, and the third one class important footnote. So I can use multiple class definitions here for a single element. And so not surprisingly, this will be styled like this. We have this here in bold, and then the footnote here is rendered in smaller font size. And then here, the important footnote is rendered in smaller font size and in bold on top of it. And so now this is useful because now we can be specific about certain types of elements that we care about and apply the styling that we define one time to many other cases without being overly general by defining it on an element. And I have complete control, of course, how I call that, right? I can call this like not important. And then down here, I can apply that, and you will see that this here is not matching anymore, therefore it's not bold anymore. While this one here, which I changed, is obviously still matching. Okay, the companion is, which we talked about already, is the Id selector. Here I have the example for anchor tags. So Id selectors are exactly like class selectors, with the one difference that they are only supposed to be used with a single element on your website. So these are really they're supposed to be unique variable names. So here I use three Id selectors, first line, second line, and important. And you can already see that I use the hashtag or the pound or the number symbol, however you want to call it. I'm going to call it hashtag to identify these elements. And so here we have the first line element, second line, and an important element. So here, this is how I identify these div elements, first line, second line, and important. And notice that I've been good here, and I have actually not reused any of these ID elements. So what did we style here? We've made the first line in blue, the second line a little bit bigger, and the third line has a text shadow, the important one. And so this is how it looks like. And so now, trick question, what happens if I do this? So now basically I see that my second div of the same type is also styled the same way. So what I've done here is I've kind of abused the ID tag to work just like a class tag. It works in the browsers, it shouldn't work. Well, it will break a lot of stuff if you stop that, but you should never do that, right? You should really make sure that an ID element is really unique on your website. You really want this to be a unique element. Browsers are very different from, let's say, compilers for languages like C that are very strict about what input they will accept. Browsers simply do the best they can and try to generate output. That has historical reasons, but we care about making things really adhere to the standards, because that kind of make sure that it will work for for a longer time, and make sure that it will work for different kinds of browsers, different kinds of devices. Also browsers that, for example, people use screen readers. So we care about making these things really work well. So for example, if I had to use, if I use this ID here as important, and then I wanted to use this important tag as an anchor to link deeply into my document, it would be ambiguous which element I mean, right? So that would be one of the problems that come from that. Okay, of course we can combine ID element and class elements. one way to, like, what we could do with ID elements is if we have, for example, a page layout, right? So here I have created a trivial page layout where I have like a menu on what's, yeah?
For IDs, can you put two IDs like you can to classes in the?
I guess you can.
Would it still work?
Yep. Well, let's look at. Can you?
You can put two IDs together, but then you can't select them.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
So
So
not
you
very
can just say like put first line here and have go to the styling from the first line ID.
Yeah, let's try it. So yeah, it actually doesn't match. So you can put it in, it will still render the content, but it will not apply the style. So thanks, Steve. So we want, like this example here is one of them. So here we want to generate, let me just refresh this because I modified this. We want to like have some elements, like I have one menu on my website, right? Then I don't need to do like a class menu. I will simply give my div that is my menu an ID menu. Then I will have like a footer on my website, and then I will give this div that represents the footer an ID footer. Well, it's semantics, right? It's like, it is readable. Like if you as a programmer then see an ID element, you know that this is supposed to be unique on the website, and I can actually safely assume that if I query for that element, I will get only one of them. If I query for a class, I actually have to assume that I'll get multiple matches, right? So it kind of like, we've seen that it actually, if they're not equal, they will actually not render properly if you use multiple IDs. But even if they were, you still like there would be like an important semantic difference. Yeah, so this is like a good example of where I would use an ID because I might want to like identify my menu on the side, my main content, and my footer separately. And so here I have kind of like defined this. This is the main part of the page with all the content, which is basically, I also use this like more advanced elements here that we have like semantic elements like article and main and footer and so on nowadays, but I could make this all into divs. Like here nav is actually another element that simply tells our browser that this is a navigation element. They basically work like divs. I give them sidebar, and then I essentially position them, and I style them accordingly. So I tell them, you have a certain height, you have a certain width, you float on the right, and so on. And so that basically means that I have now created like a linear document, no styling information, and I could do my sidebar on like on a web browser on a desktop. I could put it on the side. On my mobile phone, I could put it on like some menu that only reveals when I hover over it. So that is kind of like the nice thing about this. Yeah.
If you were to do an ID and a class,
Yes.
which takes precedence?
It's a tricky question. It depends on the order in the CSS definition, and I have a link down here to precedent rules in CSS. And the simple truth is it's quite a mess. And so, yeah, I'll talk a little bit later about this, but it is the order of how, like, okay, no, the rule is the most specific selector will apply on top level. So if you have an ID element, it should override the class if they have conflicting information. How that is implemented in different browsers, I would worry a little bit about that. So you kind of like want to avoid these conflicts. And if it gets tricky, then you have like subtle rules, and you will have to debug them or learn the standard by heart. But debugging is probably easier, just avoiding these conflicts. Okay. Note that this is kind of like the 2005 way of creating a page layout that I'm showing here. Nowadays, you want to do do something smarter, like CSS grid layouts, or like a while ago, like 3 years ago, I would have said use something like Bootstrap to create a layout. But this is just like to illustrate the point of the IDs here. Okay, we can then create a little bit more complicated stuff with CSS relationship selectors. So, for example, we can say we have a child selector and a descendant selector. So here, this rule, P greater than B, matches all the B's that are a direct child of a paragraph. So all the bold elements that are direct children of the paragraph are blue. So this is an example here. We have a paragraph, and then we have a bold element here, and this does in fact match. Whereas another bold element, let's see, here is an example with something bold that down here doesn't match, right? So this is really says this only should apply to this combination of elements. So color blue only if I have B directly within a P. The kind of similar but slightly different one here is the descendant selector. By saying div space B, I'm telling the CSS here to match all the B's that are nested within a div, but no matter what happens in between. So I can have like a div, a span, a paragraph, and then a bold, and that will match. So here is an example where I have a div, then a span, and then a B for bold text, and you will see that this is actually, as I defined here, colored in green. Okay? So like this is just like a way of being a little bit more specific. Generally, like you probably don't want to use this a ton. It's better to be like have classes and so on that are more specific, and we create them computationally. You have other ways of doing that. Okay, so now this to your question, what happens if you have multiple rules in CSS? Then the rule is the most specific one applies, but which one is the most specific one? Here's the documentation, and that is a kind of like not necessarily super intuitive. So like when you develop something and you notice that any of your styles don't take an element, like you should probably like pull out the styles that you want to take into a separate unique class and then apply that and then move them back in. And another way like to do this, if we like let's say we can also kind of like do this interactively, right? We don't have to write this code in some complicated way. We can simply like modify any style attributes temporarily. Like we can say inspect this particular one, and then it actually tells me here in the developer tools I have assigned the color blue, and now I can actually change that, and I will see what happens, and I can add like other styles in here. So I can say inspect, I can say here add like font or font size is like 150%. And now this is big, like enlarged. And this is like, I've done this interactively. This is now like, of course, completely volatile. Once I reload the browser, it's gone. But this is like a nice way to debug something and to temporarily also disable, like you can uncheck something. Like here I can remove the color temporarily to see like what rule would apply if I didn't have that rule here, and it will be structural. And if you look at a complicated website, you will see that fairly many styles are stuck out here because they're overwritten at some other point. One other thing that's useful to know about are so-called pseudo classes. Pseudo classes are like not selectors for elements on your website, but more of states. And so like a typical example is the hover element. So here I can hover over an element, and once I hover over it, it changes its appearance, because here I have a class hoverable. Of course, this could be any name again, and that has like bold. But then I have hoverable pseudo class hover. I give it this bluish or greenish background color here. And then once I've had my mouse over it, you can see that the greenish background color here is applied. Another common pseudo class is the visited one, which is usually very useful for an anchor, right, or for a link. So if you want to control how your link appears after it's been visited, and I've already clicked on this here, but what we can do is we can open this in a new page, and then we can, like, if you want to see what is going on with my code, independent of any browser cache or something like that, you can always switch to an incognito browser. And so now you'll see that this here is rendered in blue. And because it doesn't access the browser history, so for this window, the anonymous window, this has never been visited, right? And for my regular window where I already clicked on it, the visited mark is active, and that's why it's shown in green. If I click on this, like, the anonymous mode doesn't track anything, so if I go back, it will still be blue. So anonymous is also useful if you want to see whether there are any caching problems with your website. Okay. So we've used like inline, or we've used kind of like in the HTML, in the header CSS definitions. There's two other ways of using defining CSS definitions. The first one, which we commonly will use, is to include an external style file. So here I am saying, like, this is something I would put in the header and say, here we have a style sheet that is at this source, style.css, and this is where I keep my styles that I can use across multiple files now. And the third way is to do inline style declaration. So here, I don't have any style information here in the header. I also don't include anything, but I do this directly in the tag. Style color steel blue. So that's possible. Why might this not be the best idea? Exactly. It's not reusable in other places. If I wanted to use some other bold element that I want to make blue, then I couldn't do that this way. So if you write HTML by hand, this should be used rarely, if at all. If we generate HTML code, as we'll do with JavaScript, this isn't the worst thing to do. So, like, because you have the portability of where you apply this inline styling in your code, but if you write HTML, like pure HTML, you usually shouldn't do like inline styling. Yes.
The inline styling, will that override the CSS styling?
Probably yes, since it's more specific. But I would have to try for sure. But I would guess like 90% is not inclusive.
Or you can tag it with bang important, and then that would force it to go back to the style sheet.
Say that again.
You can put a exclamation mark important, and then that will override the overrides.
That's what I mean with messy.
And then is it true that you can basically do everything with classes in terms of ID? And then another question is, why would you ever use an ID when you can just do everything with classes?
Yeah, so it's a semantic difference. So like, no, it's not true that you can do, like, they're not equivalent, as we saw earlier, right? You cannot apply two IDs to one element. You can apply as many classes as you want to one element. And all of these will match. But you also, if you could, you should still not do that, because an ID is supposed to be like a globally unique identifier for one particular element on your DOM. Because if you later write a computer program like in JavaScript, like, you want to be sure that if you access something by ID, that you get back exactly one element. Does it make sense?
Yeah, but I can also see like the time that you just make a single class for a specific only element.
But you should, well, you can of course do that, but it's like, it's like, think of it a coding convention. Like, I have certain ways of naming a variable in a programming language. So similarly, even if I could achieve a similar behavior as a class, if I wanted to be unique on my website, I should also use an ID.
But there's also intra-page links that hash.
Yes, the interpage links, the anchors that I showed earlier, another reason. But those are like, well, they are important, but not quite as important as actually the program semantics behind it. Any other questions about selectors or CSS? Okay, great. So I'll move on to SVG now. SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics, and SVG uses a similar, looks similar to HTML, but it's actually like a different language that we have on top of HTML. So SVG is super powerful. We can do like graphics with it, and they're, as the name says, scalable, right? So it's not a pixel graphic. If I zoom in, it will always remain a perfect vector graphic on my computer screen. SVG is something that you can, for example, export from Adobe Illustrator or from any other vector graphics drawing program, whereas like Photoshop would be like a pixel equivalent. SVG is one way of doing graphics on the web. The other ones are Canvas and WebGL. Canvas is a pixel-based approach, and WebGL gives you the whole power of your graphics card to do 3D rendering. We'll not be covering either Canvas or WebGL in this class, but they are sometimes useful, or Canvas is sometimes useful instead of SVG because it's faster. So if you have a lot of like stuff that you want to show on a website, Canvas might be a different approach, and WebGL, of course, like in SVG, like we could try to do some 3D effects, but in practice, like whenever you start going into 3D, you really want to move from SVG to WebGL. But that's a completely different programming language, right? And there's very little overlap. So like this, you would learn like WebGL in the Viz for scientific, or OpenGL and Viz for scientific data course, and then you could like OpenGL very similar to WebGL. So that would be one way of doing that. And with WebGL, you can also nowadays program games in your computer, right? Like computer games, 3D, any kind of 3D scene graphic, essentially. But for like visualization, as we do it, SVG is kind of like the best solution, and not at least because it's kind of like the target of the D3 library, which we'll be using. I should note that we could do everything independent of D3 just using these basic web standards, but D3 will make our lives easier. So here is like the absolute minimal example. I have like an HTML page, and within that HTML page, I define an SVG that has a certain width and a certain height. I close the SVG, and then I close my HTML, and the output is super boring. It's just a white page. But if I inspect this, I can actually see that there is this SVG element in here. So the element exists, there's just nothing drawn on top of it. Okay, let's draw something. We have now like certain geometric shapes that we can use in SVG. So we have like one basic thing would be a circle. So we can draw a circle like this. And to specify a circle, we have to give it an x and a y coordinate, which kind of like position, like define the center of the circle, and then we have a radius parameter. And so this is how I would define a circle. A circle, cx is 200, cy is 100, radius is 50. And then I use some style attributes here. Let's tell it fill gray, stroke steel blue, stroke width 5 pixels. And this is the circle that appears here. Okay, that's simple enough. You kind of like for every SVG element that we'll have, there's a specific set of attributes, like in this case, cx, cy, and radius.
So that style attribute, I guess, is referring to the CSS.
So yes, I'll talk about this a little bit later. Short answer is it is partially a CSS, compatible with CSS, partially some custom thing for SVG specifically. So whenever you try to apply some styling to your SVG and it doesn't take, just check whether this is actually defined for SVG and not only for HTML. So for example, color means something like color in HTML means that the object that you contain is colored. In SVG, you have to say fill color, fill dash color. So there's differences, and it's a mess, but that's like how a lot of the web is.
Does that have to be defined inline?
No. This is just a simple example. I show more examples later. And there's also there's stuff that I can define as attributes or as style elements. So there's different ways of doing that. Yes?
The coordinates for the circle, is that relative to the SVG window or the entire web page?
It's relative to my SVG element, and it is actually, my next point here is coordinate systems in SVG. So that's a great segue. So like this is, if you look at this now in the new page, and if we inspect this, we can see that the SVG here, it's 400 wide, and this is right in the middle of this, right? So it's the X position is 200. So it's not relative to the page, it's relative to your SVG. So one thing that is interesting, or that you need to know about SVG, is that its coordinate system starts at the top left. So here I'm illustrating this. I'm setting 3 circles with a position of 10, 10, 40, 40, 70, 70, and you see the 10, 10 here starts at the top left. So if you generate SVG, you have to keep that in mind, right? If I wanted to create a scatter plot, which we usually think of starting at the bottom, I have to do some math before I specify the attributes to actually be able to map a data vector to a scatter plot. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but this is kind of important to know. The other thing is these dimensions that I specify here, they're actually like user units. They do by default map directly to pixels. However, your operating system defines pixels. This is another messy area because like MacBooks have many more pixels in reality than they actually give to people to program for. So like this in SVG, this is kind of these user element that by default map to pixels, but there are ways of kind of telling it, hey, scale that by give me a big or a different number of pixels for my user element, and that's also like why it's scalable vector graphics, right? But we won't be bothering too much about this. Think of it as pixels. It's a safe way to think about it, but just be aware that you can flexibly scale it. So here I come into this what we talked about earlier, presentation properties like styling for SVG. And so there are certain things that are controlled by attributes. And you can think of everything that you absolutely need for a shape is usually an attribute, right? I can't draw a circle without a radius and the position. So all of those parameters will be attributes. I can draw a circle without specifying its color. So this is then not an attribute, but it's a style. And so you can control it by CSS property. But there, as I said, you can have certain optional attributes. Like here, for example, I can say fill gray, and I earlier did this here, fill gray as a style definition, right? So I can do it either as a style definition or as an attribute definition. So these are called presentation attributes. So this is equivalent to the other. And I personally don't really care which way you go. I tend to kind of style with the style attributes as much as I can, and then have the attributes that are required as attributes. And then, as I already mentioned before, SVG style attributes are not the same as HTML style attributes. So, background color would have the same effect for a div than fill color would, or the fill attribute would have for an SVG rectangle. The other thing that is inconsistent is remember the tooltip I showed earlier with the title attribute? That also doesn't work in SVG. So instead, here is how you do a tooltip in an SVG element. So you create the circle element, and then usually what we did is we close the circle right here. But in this case here, we keep it open and we have some content within the circle element. And then the content here is our title. And so now I have this more information on hover that appears whenever I hover my mouse here. And so you'll actually have to use this in the homework. Another CSS shape is the ellipse. Ellipse is just like a circle, just that it has a radius for x and a radius for y, which we see here, and then this renders it like that. So that's a simple example. You will use a lot of rectangles. Rectangles have like an x position, a y position, a width, and a height position. And x and y refers to the upper left corner here. So this is 50-50 from origin, and then width is of course horizontal, and height is vertical. So this is a 200 by 100 rectangle at position 50-50. For lines, I have to specify 2 points. I can say, like, I have to say x1, like 2 points with 2 coordinates each. So x1, y1, x2, y2. And this is exactly also the definition here. Like I'm saying here, I have a line starting at 30-30 going to 280. And so, like, again, remember the coordinate system, there we definitely have a line with this slope. But here, the second line is 30-50, starting a little bit lower, and 150, 120. Okay, so that's simple enough. We can also use text in SVG. This is, of course, super useful if you create something like labels directly on the on your SVG element. And so here is like text that I specify it by x and y position. And notice that here, like in HTML, we have all of this like floating and dynamic layouting stuff. But in SVG, we usually just do like static hard layouts. It's at position 30-30. There isn't actually like a way of making this really float well. And so like looks just like regular text, so that's simple enough. And then like we've talked about some, yes.
If you have text in an SVG and then for some reason you want to scale it because it is scalable with vector graphics, does the text properly scale with your graphic?
Yes.
Okay.
It does. It kind of look weird if you scale. Like that's why we'll talk later about some scaling and transforming, and that is always a tricky thing if you do that with text, right? Because you get like the super big letters, or if you also do some distortion or something like that, it gets ugly. So we talked about basic shapes like rectangles and circles and so on. The kind of like, if we want to break out of those basic shapes, we have to use the path element. And so with the path element, we can create like arbitrary lines, or we can also fill this and then create like arbitrary shapes from that. And the path element uses like a mini built-in programming language, a micro language. And this is actually like it's not that difficult, at least if you stay like in non-curve space. M is moved to a position without drawing a line. So this is basically start at 0, 0. M1010 tells me to move my pen to 1010. And I'm not drawing anything at this point. This is just like where my pen currently is. L draws a line from the previous position. So if I had M1010, L2020, I would now get a diagonal line from 1010 to 2020. Okay? Z closes a path using a straight line to the first point. So if I now added a Z, I wouldn't actually see anything because it would just go back to the first point. But if I added another L like to like 2040 and then a Z, then I would have drawn a triangle. Okay? And then C allows us to draw curves. And there's different curves, basically based on which curve function you want to use. I'm going to just show the cubic Bezier curves here, just to illustrate how they work. Okay, so here is our path element. And notice there's no X or Y or anything like that. This is all specified completely in this like mini language here. So I'm drawing a line from 1010, or I'm moving my pen to 1010, drawing to 5010, 5050, 150, 110. Okay? So this is this part here of the shape. So I've created this set of lines here. Okay? Now if I were to change this from 0 to 10, I would get Zero, zero, we see that a little bit better, right? So we start at the origin of our SVG here. If we modify any of those elements, we can see like 70, 10. We can see that we can like now draw every arbitrary shapes. And then if we were to add a Z here, then it will close this shape. now we have a closed shape, and we could also define a fill. And this is how I could create an area chart or any kind of like arbitrary object that I want to draw. Okay, let me refresh this. And now I want to talk about the curve. So for the curve, I'm like, it works just, it basically, like, if you know a little bit about Bezier curves, it's used, yeah.
So with the, that comes back to the very first was drawn, right? So not from wherever.
Yes. To the very, or like where you started with your project.
Okay, so if we did another move in there somewhere in the middle, and then we did Z, it would still go back to the very first point.
That's a good question. I actually don't know. Let's check. Yeah, so this line here, it's not really hard to tell. So it does not, it goes back to the M. So it goes back to the last M in that case. Generally, I would recommend to not use, like, I would use two path elements if you have an M in between there. So like just two path elements, and then you know exactly what to close. Yes?
Can you like offset the whole shape? Yeah, you go through.
Yes. I'll talk about this next. Yep.
I'm noticing on these text codes that the position you're specifying is the bottom left of the text. Is that correct?
Yes. These are just for illustration purposes here, but yeah, that's that looks to be the case. So okay, let's talk about this the curve here. So I'm defining here the curve that like it starts from the previous point as in anything else, and then we define these support points. And so we have like one support point here at 150, and then let me refresh this again so that it's a little clearer. I have one support point at 150, which is where I have like added this red dot here with the label 2. So this is my origin is at point 1, which is defined at 110 here. Then I have the support point for the curve. Then I have another support point here for the curve, the third one, that's at 150 and 50. And then I have a closing point, 150, 10. And so then we have like, we use the curve function to interpolate between those 4 points and draw this curve. And if I were to change now any of those points, then we would see like the shape of the curve change in some way. Something like this, right? So we can kind of create arbitrary curves like this. Of course, the support point here didn't update accordingly, but you probably get the picture. There are many other curve interpolation functions, and we'll talk a little bit more. Like the nice thing is this language here looks a little bit like it's not super easy to write. We will in fact like not use this directly much. There's one example on your homeworks where you're supposed to use this both with the tilt shape and the line, but like maybe like basically after this week we'll be only generating those paths with V3 for us, so we will not actually have to write our own path elements. There is this MDN path tutorial which kind of like goes into the details of path, and as you can imagine, like there's a lot of interesting curve functions that you could use with different support points and so on. So if you're interested in this stuff, this tutorial is quite useful. Another thing that we have to be aware of is ordering. Like the order in which elements are drawn is the order in which they appear in our SVG element. So here we have 2 times the same code, just to switch order. We have 2 elements that overlap. So one, we have the ellipse first, and then the rectangle on top, and then the rect first, and then the ellipse on top. So like there isn't like a z value that I can specify like a third dimension. Whatever is on top, you really have to take care of where it is rendered in the order in the SVG. Okay. And then there's two more things that are quite useful and that we'll be also using a lot. Grouping and transformations, to answer your question about whether I couldn't like move all of this at once. Yes, I can. First let's talk about grouping. So grouping is basically like, this is what I do here. I'm defining a group, and that group contains all kinds of elements. And so this is like a div in HTML, right? It's not something that's visible, but it's something that puts stuff together. So I would maybe put all of my dots in a scatter plot in one single group, so I can like move them all together. And like this is something that is very useful because I also like can like work in different coordinate systems. If I had to, like if I want to do something that is like I can do simple math and just like look at the data element from like the local origin and then move it somewhere else, and I don't always have to keep track of where what is like the position of element globally on the data page, right? I can do this relative to the group, the positioning of the elements in the group, and then move the whole group. And so here's a simple example. I have like a rectangle and then 3 circles in a group, and I've kind of like abused the group here to do some styling. So we see that this fill parameter is inherited by all of the elements that are contained here. So if we look at this, we will like, well, if we inspected this, we will see that these are elements, but it's not actually the group here. Other than the fill, it's not actually visible, right? And so we can use these groups and compare it in conjunction with transformations. And of course, we can also use transformations on individual elements, but they're like also quite useful on groups. And so here is an example of a transformation where like I kind of created, like I used the same chart as above. Like notice I have the origin here and then 3 points. And here I've created a transformation that flips over the y-axis, and so that I can now kind of specify the points according to like a coordinate system starting at the bottom. So how do I do this? I use the transform attribute, and there here we have another mini language in here. So we have a translation and a scale attribute. There are also other attributes that can actually do distortions as well. And so how to read this is like the scale, it starts from right to like interpretation from right to left. The scale attribute is defined in x and in y. I'm saying like multiply all of my y values with -1 and then move them over 200. And this is kind of like how I get to this coordinate system. Okay? So that sounds like a great idea. I'll just use, like if I prefer, like in visualization, we often think there's a coordinate system originating at the bottom. I could just always do that. Turns out, would be great, but in practice, like text really screws us. Because if you want to create labels, then we would get something like this. Text as they read in Australia here. So transformations apply to everything, of course. Not the tooltips, but to any other text that I generate. So in practice, translations are super useful, and then scaling and other rotations and so on are very often useful, but not quite as frequently as just translations. Yes?
So transformations happen, you said the scale happens first and then the translate. Is it always the scale first, or is it just the
right to left?
Okay.
Yeah.
Should we put that in CSS instead of doing transform equals?
No, that you can't actually put that in CSS. This is SVG specific, right?
Well, the transform, translate, and scale are presentable attributes, so we can.
I don't think that works in CSS. You know, can I do a transform in CSS?
No. Like CSS, like part of the attributes are either like get attributes as either attributes or styles, and CSS only supports styles. Some attributes can be used in CSS, but it throws an error like in a validation stage.
Yeah, I wouldn't, like, I'm not promising 100%, but I would be surprised if the transform ever can define that in CSS. Okay, we have like 7 minutes left. I'll take any questions about SVG. Yeah. Sure. it's not the way, like it will make it not necessarily easier, you will have to type less. And you want to have to do any math. If you want to, like, we're fine with whichever solution you come up with. You can simply use the data as specified and like use that as your coordinates and then scale it accordingly so that you have something a little bit bigger. Or you can do like a pre-processing step on like in your head or on paper and then use the coordinates accordingly. Like in, if you implemented this with D3, you would probably like do a multiplication and not use a scale. But our reference solution does use a scale. It's less code. So, yes.
I looked up the unattributed as presentable and visual.
So you're saying I can define it as a style attribute?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting. Didn't know that.
Is there any math like latex in HTML or CSS?
Not like definitely there are ways to do it. I don't know whether you can do it without an external library. So like what usually happens is that you would actually write like there's libraries that where you can actually put in latex and then show that on the website. But I think that those are like JavaScript libraries.
At the assignment prompt, you said you must use selectors to style your SVG elements, and then you should only have about one class per type of plot. But if we start using scales and transforms in CSS selectors, suddenly we need many, many more classes.
I'm basically, this isn't styling, right? Positioning and visualization isn't styling, but I mean the styling is color and line thickness. Okay, so we have 4 minutes left.